So when you're talking about something like an assault weapon ban, you're talking not just a ban on the item itself, but engaging in lawful conduct, like you said,
Yep.
going hunting, training, self-defense, and defense against a tyrannical government, either foreign or domestic. You know, one of the probably most useful items we could have would be an AR-15 to protect our nation.
Hey guys, Sure Michael Singleton here. We're going to go over the top 3 anti-gun arguments that I'm sure you may have heard of and maybe you haven't heard of. Well, I have my buddy Anthony Miranda here. He's going to sort of help me break through some of these issues. He's an attorney, so what not better than to have a lawyer break through some of the legal nuance of some of these topics. Anthony, thanks for being here, my man.
Appreciate it, brother.
Armed scholar. I love that, armed scholar. I mean, so Anthony, there are all of these arguments that are constantly being perpetuated. And for some people who are just a lay gun person, they're like, oh my God, how do I make sense of all of this? What would you say is number one?
So the number one I would pick, and I think it's interesting because it's got a lot of history behind it. It's an argument that's been made for a very long time and has been debunked in the legal world for a very long time and is no longer a good legal argument. And yet you still see a lot of people on the anti-gun side or the left, or whatever you want to categorize, still use it. And it's something that perforates through mainstream media, but also still pops up even in the legal world. And that is that the text of the Second Amendment, when it mentions a well-regulated militia, means that the government can put in place government restrictions or government regulations. So they point often to the text of the Second Amendment, try to use it against us, saying, well, obviously it says well-regulated. That means government regulation, government restriction. We can put in place gun control laws. And that's not true. If you look, I mean, the easiest way to debunk this and the fastest way to really debunk this argument is just pointing to Supreme Court precedent. You know, how shocking. We've had the Supreme Court weigh in on this very issue when they've addressed, you know, what does a well-regulated militia really mean? And you had the late great Justice Scalia say, well, a well-regulated militia in that text in the Second Amendment does not mean government restriction.
And that's funny you bring up Scalia, because what Scalia also did, he went all the way back to writings from that time. How was this interpreted at the time? What was the intent? So that's a really good point.
And he expressly has written, and you can read it in the Heller, so don't take my word for it. Go back to Heller.
Go back and read it, guys.
Look at the Heller decision, and Justice Scalia has said that regulated, as mentioned in the text of the Second Amendment, means well-organized, well-trained individuals or members of the militia. But it does not mean government overreach. It does not mean government restrictions.
It doesn't say a well-regulated militia that is overseen by the government or that is put together by the government.
No, so that is something that has not been a valid legal argument for a while, but you still see it.
So how should people respond to that? If I'm a lay gun person and somebody says, well, well-regulated militia means the government can have control over this, what would you say should be the response?
So first I would say, you know, that as a legal argument in the legal world, we've had justices, we've had historians look back at what that was intended to mean. So, you know, in the legal world, there are a bunch of different theories and people who address the text of the Second Amendment, and you have people who are textualists and originalists, which, you know, that's what I consider myself. And you have people who are a little bit more progressive, which is you have some of the more left-leaning justices who take on that. But as an originalist and a textualist, when you look at the text of the Second Amendment, you're supposed to find what is the true meaning, what was the intent behind what they wrote. And what you do is you go back to when it was ratified in 1791. What did they mean when they said
what was written about it? What were journalists writing about at the time? I mean, it's so funny you really say that, because I've seen some attorneys who are constitutional scholars who don't even agree with the Second Amendment, but have said, but when you go back to research, when this was ratified, what the arguments were made from the documents that we can find, it's kind of pretty clear that they didn't mean regulated in terms of government encroachment on that regulation. And that's an important distinction.
Absolutely, and it's kind of one of the failures of our judicial system. You know, after the Supreme Court issued their Heller decision, you know, they didn't take up, you know, they had McDonald after, but then really after that, there was about 14 years of gap before the Supreme Court addressed the new Bruen decision. And that led to them twisting some of the history or saying, well, we don't necessarily need to look at history or tradition.
Because we're going to look at it in a modern context.
And a lot of
which was a different approach to the Constitution for people who are watching.
They advocated for a more modern approach. And then, you know, we had the most recent awesome decision by the Supreme Court in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen. And they said, no, we got to go back to the fundamentals, text, history, and tradition. What was the intent behind this fundamental document, and they said all those things that the Ninth Circuit has been running away with and
Just not
applying is no
constitutional.
longer valid.
So that makes sense in terms of number one and sort of understanding the Second Amendment and what a well-regulated militia means. And the historical context is incredibly important because we want to know what the people who wrote it meant at the time that they wrote it.
Absolutely.
What would you say is number two, though?
So the number two that I would point to is something that's come up kind of in the modern era, and it's become more prevalent. And you have individuals like President Biden pointed out and then you have more people in mainstream media like Jon Stewart recently did an interview on the Second Amendment, and he made this point, and is that the leading cause of death in children is firearms.
Yeah.
So that is their new talking point, their new, club that they are using against the Second Amendment.
Which is
Second Amendment
inaccurate
advocates.
because I'm a political strategist. I do a lot with numbers. And if you're going to segment a group, what age are the children? Are we saying anyone from a baby to 21? Anyone from a baby to 18? Are we saying from anyone from a baby to 14 as a child, and then from 15 to 18 as a teenager, and then from 18 and beyond as an adult? I mean, how are we segmenting this data? Because it gives a false picture.
Absolutely. And this is something when I try to teach people how to be a better 2A advocate, I try to tell them that you have to take a nuanced approach. The first one, we addressed it using legal arguments, looking at historical precedent and historical evidence. With this one, it's more of you have to understand and actually look at the data and the polls that they are
You
pulling
have
from.
to look at the cross
You have to
tabulations.
look at it. So so for this one specifically, how I address it, and I teach people to address this new one, is okay, if you look at this report from the CDC and some of these other reports that they're pulling to push this, leading cause of death in children is firearms or gun violence or whatever they're claiming. When you look at the data that they're pulling, first of all, it's children ages 1 to 18 plus, so actually 1 to 19 years old. And with that, they're encapsulating a lot of stuff. So first, one of the things that should jump out at everybody is, since when did we treat 18 and 19-year-olds as children?
Never.
In every other context in our nation, we treat them as adults.
Yeah.
They're allowed to enter into contracts. They're allowed to go to war.
Right, in many places, in many states, and correct me, you're the lawyer here, but I'm almost certain most states at 17, you commit a heinous crime, you're tried as an adult.
Tried as an adult. Yeah, you can enter into marriage. You can get married at 18.
Yeah.
So in every other context, we treat 18-plus-year-olds, 19-year-olds as adults. But in this context of the poll that they're now trying to use against us, and the statistics that they're trying to use against us, they're lumping them into the category of children. And we'll get to why they're doing that. The other thing, when you look at that specific data, you will see when you pull down through the CDC's website that they are excluding children ages 0 to 1 years old. So they exclude all typical children and even infants. Now, they claim that they did that because they, within that data, they claimed that you would find that most children would be passing away because of accidents or, maybe child defects, things of that nature. But that's important when you're going to make a claim about what is the leading cause of death of children. Why are you excluding some data, excluding some groups, and then adding in other groups? And it is really to reach a specific goal, and it is that they wanted this piece of data to point to that the leading cause of death in children is firearms, so that they can use this to advocate for gun control.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I want to get your opinion on this. For some people who are looking at this data and they may say, well, I don't necessarily understand cross tabulations. And that essentially means you look at the face value of a data. If you ever look at polls or anything, they're usually asked the type of question or where the data came from. Usually you'll see sometimes explanations about the why. Those things are really important because once you start to unpack that stuff, Anthony, you're like, well, wait a minute here, 18-year-olds are babies now? Or they're not including infants ages 0 to 1 yet. The compilation of this data is supposed to be about infant or child mortality, yet they're sort of excluding things that you would think should be a part of child mortality. So what do you say to people who may say, man, that's a lot of research, that's a lot to get into, but if I get into it, how do I then explain it to people?
I think a lot of that is just...
Because this is a lot of nuance.
It's a lot of nuance, but a lot of this stuff you can address at a surface level. And I think for this one specific, it would be, you need to understand the why. So whenever a piece of data is being put forward, you have to first think about why. Why is this? Well, they're trying to advocate for gun control or a piece of legislation. So why are they doing this? And then what are they doing within this piece of data to address this, to meet the
and we're
end?
not saying, and I want to be clear for people who may be a little bit skeptical, you're not saying, Anthony, we shouldn't understand why kids or babies or infants
No.
die.
No.
What you're saying is we don't want skewed arguments or skewed data that is against the right to keep and bear arms, which appears to
yeah.
be the case here.
Absolutely. I mean, if you really wanted to address the question of the leading cause of death in children, then yes, let's look at the real numbers and let's address what the true
Whatever that
leading cause
issue
is, whatever
is,
that
yeah.
is. But when you start with, I want this end goal, and let me do something over here to help me achieve this, that's where I start to
Yeah.
have issues.
Yeah.
And so one of the things when you look at that group, like you said, you can pull specific numbers out. When you look at individuals ages 14 to 19-year-olds with
Yeah,
their
we should break it down. That's what I would do.
I'll look at it, break it down, and say, okay, where are these numbers really coming? Where are these deaths come from? A lot of it is gang-related, inner city, situations, and suicides. A lot of that. So you can say that yes, there are these gun deaths within that, and let's address that. But also, let's just not throw this bucket of adults and gang violence and all these things, and just act as if it is. And a lot of the times, what they're advocating as far as gun control is a child. They try to put
Because when
forward
people
this
think of
picture.
youth,
Yes.
at least for me, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I think most people think of youth. You think of someone like 10, 9, 8. You're not thinking someone who's 18 or 19 years old.
Sometimes when you hear the leading cause of death is children, you envision this poor
Words
child
matter, man.
picking
Yeah.
up a firearm on your nightstand, and that's leading to death. That is not what is
And for
actually.
most people, like, holy smoke, we got to do something about this.
Absolutely.
But
That's not what the data.
That's
is
not what the
actually
data is saying,
It is
yeah.
not. It's not showing a poor child picking up a firearm on a nightstand. It is a lot of gang violence. It's a lot of suicide. It's a lot of other criminal conduct that is going on.
so if I'm a person watching this video and I'm saying, wow, this is an incredible conversation between Anthony and Shermichael, I want to make sure that I can explain this to other people. What's an easy way to unpack this without getting into the nuance of the data and how data is compiled?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is the data does not reflect actually what they are claiming. The data is skewed. It leaves out some groups. It includes other groups. And so you can't just purely rely on data.
On data alone, yeah. And what would you say, Anthony, is number 3?
So the number 3 argument that's being put forward by the gun control advocates right now is that certain things do not fall under the definition of what an arm is under the Second Amendment. So this has kind of been more of a response to the Supreme Court's decision in Bruin.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times, in prior situations, a lot of the attorney generals in these states or at the federal government, they really didn't have to do their job. I think it's kind of funny they got free paychecks because they had a lot of courts that were in their favor, who were willing to just buy whatever public interest they put forward. So now they've had to become a little bit more crafty with their arguments. So a lot of what they're putting forward now is that certain things are not arms. Magazines are not arms protected by the Second Amendment. Certain rifles, AR-15s, are not arms protected by the Second Amendment because they're not in common use for lawful purposes. In fact, they claim that they are dangerous.
Although we know that most gun-related deaths that are purposeful, not accidents, that are purposeful with pistols, not with AR-15s. Not even close with AR-15s.
So to combat this of certain things, so let's just focus on one of them.
Yeah.
One of the common ones that's popping up a lot and is being litigated heavily right now is in regards to the AR-15. There has been certain states and attorney generals who have put in place laws and are advocating for AR-15 bans. And they claim that they can do that because an AR-15 is not an arm as protected by the Second Amendment, because it is something that they believe is dangerous. Now, the way we combat that as a 2A advocate is, what is the true test? What has the Supreme Court told us the true test is when you're looking at these items to figure out what is protected and what is not?
Yeah.
An arm that is protected by the Second Amendment is anything that is in common use for lawful purposes.
AR-15 is one of the most popular.
One of the most popular firearms in the nation. One of the ways the states are trying to get around that right now is they're trying to argue that if they put in place a law at a state level that bans something, well, then it's not in common use anymore. So it's almost this circular argument that they're making is
it's not in common use.
It's not in common use because I ban it. And therefore, I'm not violating the Second Amendment.
Right.
But I'm
It doesn't
violating.
work that way.
So-
You're violating it by trying to take it out of common use.
And exactly. So when you point out these circular arguments that they're
man.
making, the absurdity of these arguments, it's very enlightening to people. And also one of the basic illegal arguments you can make against it is the test is not just simply if a firearm is dangerous.
Yeah.
What the Supreme Court said is it dangerous and unusual. We're talking about the most common firearm
Right.
owned across the nation. So by no way could it meet the definition of something that is dangerous and unusual.
Yeah.
It is clearly in common use. It's owned by the millions across the United
Millions,
States.
hunting, competitive shooting, and even home defense.
And that is even more of a nuanced argument because right now
Yeah.
we're just focusing on what arms are protected by the Second Amendment. We're not even
right.
talking about conduct
Yeah.
that is protected. And so when you're talking about something like an assault weapon ban, you're talking not just a ban on the item itself, but engaging in lawful conduct, like you said,
Yep.
going hunting, training, self-defense, and defense against a tyrannical government, either foreign or domestic. One of the probably most useful items we could have would be an AR-15 to protect our nation.
Easy to shoot.
So that is just, those are, for my opinion, some of the three biggest arguments that we see right now being put forward by the anti-gunners. That's how I address a lot of that stuff.
So Anthony, we went through the top three. I think those are incredibly important. I think our viewers will learn a lot from this. But if there's a curveball that came in, what would that one be?
To me, I think one of the interesting curveballs that was put forward for a long time was actually struck down by the Supreme Court in Bruin recently, but you still see pop up quite a bit, is how far does your right extend? So a lot of the people on the anti-gun side will say the Second Amendment at its core only applies to self-defense.
Yeah.
And they will try to cabin it to only protection of self-defense. And also what they try to do is they only try to say it applies to self-defense within your home.
Yeah.
So the second you walk outside of your home,
You no longer have the
magically
right.
your rights
It's gone.
disappear. And we treat no other right like that. It's not like we would ever say
Free
you
speech isn't.
you lose free speech the second you walk outside of your home. We would never say that.
No.
But we have anti-gunners try to say that when it applies to the Second Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court addressed that. Justice Thomas addressed that. He said there's an individual fundamental right to carry and defend yourself outside of your home.
Yeah.
That exists outside
Where
of the public.
most of the instances would occur outside of the
And that's
home.
exactly what Thomas pointed to. He said you're at greatest risk actually when you're out
Outside
in
the home.
public. Exactly.
Is common sense not so common anymore, Anthony?
It is not. It is not common. It's definitely not when you're dealing with some of these attorney generals and these
Clearly,
lawsuits.
man. Clearly, Anthony of Arms Scholar.
Appreciate
I
it, brother.
appreciate you, man.
Appreciate
Thanks
it,
so
man.
much. So, guys, those are the top three issues that you may hear from anti-gunners and how you should appropriately respond. And we also threw a curveball in. Do you have the right to defend yourself outside of the home, or is it only reserved for in the home? Think about that for a minute. Does it make a lot of sense? I don't think it does, Anthony. I'm sure Michael Singleton, thanks so much for watching.